For the price of a cup of coffee, join my Patreon. The page includes audio documentaries not available on my YouTube channel. Link below in the description. Thanks for watching. In December of 1969, John, Paul, George and Ringo all knew the demise of the Beatles was inevitable. But no one had been prepared for the news of Paul's marriage back in March. Paul had leaked the news himself to the press before telling any of the other Beatles. None of the Fab Four were invited to attend. John, who'd been most surprised by the marriage, felt the whole thing was stage managed. He later stated, "It's just Paul being Paul." John would marry Yoko soon afterwards. He didn't want to get married like Paul, who had crowds of fans. For his ceremony, he wanted peace and quiet. John's first marriage had been back in 1962. His girlfriend Cynthia had gotten pregnant, and John felt the right thing to do was for them to marry. His Aunt Mimi opposed the wedding. When she first heard about it, she was furious. Mimi felt Cynthia had deliberately got pregnant in order to trap John in a financial situation he could never be free of. She threatened to never speak to John again if he went through with it. Obviously, she wasn't in attendance. Brian Epstein was John's best man, with George and Paul also in attendance. In the film Backbeat, Cynthia was portrayed as a clingy girl who strangely always wore a headscarf. In real life, Cynthia never actually wore one. On the day, Brian picked up Cynthia in a chauffeur-driven car and took her to the registry office. The sky was dark and looked like it could rain at any moment. When Cynthia and Brian arrived, John, George and Paul were already there, all dressed in black, pacing terribly nervous. Cynthia remembered they looked like they were going to a funeral, not a wedding. On seeing Cynthia, John leapt to his feet and greeted her happily. As the two stood and began to read their vows, a workman from across the street started a pneumatic drill, and the noise was so ear-splitting, John and Cynthia had to lean in to hear the registrar and shout their responses. It was a relief to all when it was over. Afterwards, they ate 3 courses of soup, chicken and trifle at a cheap cafe called Reese's. So broke, they toasted the meal with glasses of water. Ringo was second to marry when he too got his girlfriend pregnant. The two were married at a registry office with John and George in attendance and Brian the best man. Paul McCartney was on vacation at the time and was unable to attend. George was next to marry 1 year later in 1966. 2 years previous, he'd met Pattie Boyd, a model, on the set of A Hard Day's Night. When George first showed interest, she turned him down because she at the time had a boyfriend. When Pattie told her friend about this, she thought she was completely insane. Pattie left her boyfriend soon after, and she and George began a relationship. After 2 years, they too were married at a registry office. Paul was George's best man, and Brian Epstein was also in attendance. John and Ringo were on vacation, so they didn't attend. George and Pattie chose a registry office instead of a church because they didn't want the press involved. Despite this, the press waited outside the registry office and snapped photos of the newly married couple. They left in a Rolls Royce and had their wedding reception at the couple's bungalow. Following day, they held a press conference and then flew to Barbados for their honeymoon. Back to March of 1969, and John and Yoko attempted to get married on a ferry on its journey from England to Paris. When that failed, they flew to Gibraltar where they were wed. After that, the couple held a bed-in for peace that lasted 7 days. Many who knew the couple believed it was just a ruse to promote their marriage. Over 60 newsmen had access to their room day or night. The room was decorated with pictures of the couple during their drug bust, and messages such as "Remember Love" and "Hair Peace" were hung on the walls. At the same time, their soon-to-be new manager Alan Klein was making changes to the Beatles' company Apple. He dissolved Apple Retail, Apple Electronics, Apple Films, Apple Publishing, and any other offshoot that was producing no money. The Beatles were at this point in turmoil, but had agreed recording more music was the only solution. They were in the process of recording Abbey Road when Paul was presented with a contract to sign. The contract stated Alan Klein would manage them for the next 3 years and take a cut of 20%. The other 3 Beatles had all signed the contract, now it just needed one last signature by Paul. Alan Klein waited anxiously outside the room to be given the contract the minute Paul had signed it. Paul had previously verbally agreed to Klein managing the group, but nothing had been formally agreed. When the contract was in front of him, he began to have doubts. As the 3 Beatles waited for Paul to sign the papers, all of a sudden he stated, "He'll take 15%, referring to Klein's offer of a 20% cut. This statement angered the other 3 Beatles. They began arguing about percentages. They couldn't reach a compromise, and they were due to start a recording session. It was Friday, and Paul suggested they delay the contract signing till Monday. This angered the other 3 even more, and they tried unsuccessfully to peer pressure Paul into signing it right away. Paul refused and told them he'd look at it again on Monday and his lawyer would be present. The meeting ended with members storming out of the room and the recording session was cancelled. Needless to say, the contract was not signed by Paul on Monday, and this went on for weeks afterwards. John and Yoko at this time continued their advertising campaign for peace, presenting Baggism at a press conference in Vienna. The idea of Baggism was by covering your appearance, you couldn't be judged by skin colour, gender, hair length or age, and when communicating with another person, your message would be the only thing heard. Baggism would appear in several of John's songs during this period, first mentioned in the song The Ballad of John and Yoko, with the lyrics reading, "Eating chocolate cake in a bag." The song Come Together featured the lyrics, "He bag production," and Give Peace a Chance contained the lyrics, "Everybody's talking about Baggism." John also sent envelopes containing 2 acorns to the head of state in every country in the world. He also changed his name from Winston to Ono in a ceremony held on the roof of Apple. The public believed John had gone completely insane. When interviewed during this period, Ringo stated, "I don't know what people think about John at the moment. I know a lot of people in Liverpool are saying he's gone a bit crazy. They think he's gone off his head." Paul put John's actions down to his heroin use during this period. With all he was involved in, John forgot all about the hassles of the Beatles. It proved a good escape for him. Meanwhile, Paul was still not signing. Alan Klein at this time had negotiated an all-time high contract with EMI, which paid them 25% of royalties for each album. Impressed, Paul urged the Beatles back into the studio to finish Abbey Road. After the album was complete, John told Alan Klein he was leaving the Beatles. Klein urged him not to say anything publicly. He was in the middle of more negotiations with EMI. Publicly, Lennon began performing with a new group called the Plastic Ono Band. An appearance at Toronto's Rock Festival was booked. It would be the first live show John would perform since the Beatles quit touring in 1966. And on a side note, John loved nothing more than performing rock and roll songs in front of an audience. The Plastic Ono Band at this point contained Eric Clapton. At the back of a plane flying over the Atlantic Ocean, John and Eric sat rehearsing John's new song Cold Turkey. The two were withdrawing from heroin, and to make matters worse, they could barely hear each other's guitars. They arrived at Montreal and opened the set with blue suede shoes. During the performance, Yoko Ono entered covering herself in a white sheet and sat in the middle of the stage. She stayed there for the next couple of songs before taking the microphone and screeching into it as the band performed Yeah Blues. The set ended with John and Yoko performing a song in which Yoko wailed into the microphone and John messed around with distortion and feedback by holding and swinging his guitar near an amp. The set ended with John leaving his guitar leaning against the amp and the sound of feedback screeching. Afterwards, Lennon was ecstatic. He stated, "I can't remember when I had such a good time." Clapton later referred to the performance as a glorified jam session. As John flew back from Toronto to London, he decided he needed to end the Beatles. He agonised over how to do it for days. He sat in his bedroom chain smoking and drugged. He was irritable and impossible to be around. When the Beatles next gathered, it was to sign a contract with their American label Capitol. During the meeting, John and Paul argued over the idea of performing a TV special. As tempers flared, John announced he was leaving the group. Paul and Alan Klein both persuaded John not to again announce it publicly. Following the meeting, Paul battled with depression, and John continued his activism and regularly appeared in headlines. At this time, John had his chauffeur drive to Buckingham Palace to return his OBE he'd received from the Queen. He stated, "I'd wanted to get rid of it by 1970 anyway," and went on to say he was beginning to be ashamed of being British. The British newspaper The Daily Mirror named him Clown of the Year for 1969. At this time, Phil Spector produced John's single Instant Karma, and seeing John's delight in his work, Alan Klein hired Spector to produce Let It Be. George and Ringo were happy with that, and as Paul hadn't signed the management contract, they saw no point in involving him. The first time Paul heard anything about it was when Alan Klein sent him a mix of The Long and Winding Road with Spector's production. Along with the record came a note from Klein saying the changes were necessary. Paul went berserk. He threatened to sue Alan Klein, but was told it would be pointless. Ringo was unfortunately sent over to speak to Paul. Paul went so mad they almost came to blows before Paul threw him out the house. Paul soon after issued the press with a questionnaire, and the headline read, "Paul McCartney is quitting the Beatles." For years after, many blamed Paul for the breakup, but ironically Paul was the last person who wanted the group to end. In the coming years, Paul held out hope they would reunite. With John's death in 1980, Paul knew then the Beatles were really over. 10 years after John had split the Beatles, his death echoed his lyrics, "The dream is over."